Hello guys, and welcome back to Ginge Under the Sea, and welcome to the very first This Week in Marine Conservation. I'm going to be posting weekly videos summarising some of the most interesting and exciting news each week on marine conservation or scientific findings, and just summarising them for you guys so you don't have to go trawling through hundreds of different articles trying to find what's actually happened this week. If you guys get some value out of these, then please do give it a like below so I know you've enjoyed it, and also please comment discussing what I've talked about, or if I've forgotten any really important news from that week, then feel free, pop it in the comments what I've missed, and I'll try and include it in a later video. So let's start with a really big topic that has been being discussed over the last few weeks, which is the release of the 5th edition of the UN's Global Biodiversity Outlook report. So this report is following a 10-year plan set out by the UN to look and increase biodiversity around the world. And they put together 20 targets for all the UN countries to try and achieve by the year 2020. Now, as you've probably seen in any of the articles that have been popped up on Facebook or any other social media, the main finding from this report is that 0 out of the 20 targets set 10 years ago have been achieved, which is really quite depressing. But what I want to do is I want to look into a little bit more detail in this report and actually try and find some of the positives, some of the good things that have come over the last 10 years, some of the progress we've made, and really look at what were the targets and how far have we come and what do we still need to do to achieve those targets. So the 5 targets I am going to be talking about today, which are obviously going to be more marine based, is going to be target number 3, called incentives reformed, target number 6, sustainable management of aquatic living resources, target number 7, sustainable agriculture, aquaculture and forestry, target 10, ecosystems vulnerable to climate change, and target 11, protected areas. And as you'll see as we talk through these targets that were set out by the UN 10 years ago, that a lot of these targets are really interlinked, and we really rely on achieving certain parts of one target to be able to achieve another one, and you'll see how they all interlink together as we go through them. So the first target we are going to talk about is target number 3, which is incentives reform. So this is really looking at the business of subsidies on damaging practices. So this is mainly fossil fuel extraction and also overfishing is what they really look at in this report. So the results of this target really do show the starkest and most worrying results, as very little progress has been made. And you can see from the little diagram at the bottom of the screen here, and this is what the UN have shown a bit of color coding to the sub-targets within each target. So you can see the harmful incentives eliminated and reformed was target number 1, and positive incentives applied was number 2. And their color coding system here means that the red or orange was not achieved and not even changed, and then the yellow is some progress made. So you can see that actually the removal of harmful incentives such as subsidies to increase the range of fishing or increase the fishing effort have not been changed at all, but there have been some changes in incentives to encourage ecologically friendly ways of fishing or farming, and those processes where they are more friendly to the environment and biodiversity are starting to be incentivized a little bit, but not nearly enough, and not enough has been removed from the incentives just to carry on damaging the environment through overfishing and removing fossil fuels. Just to put this in perspective, the amount of subsidies that were paid to the fishing industry in 2018 was $35 billion, and of this money, $22 billion of that was put towards expanding or increasing fishing efforts, which is what we know already going to cause damaging effects to the environment, because we know we are already overfishing and depleting our fish stocks. So a huge chunk of the money given to fishing industry was actually just to increase their effort and to increase the damage they are doing. To really put this into perspective, a really good part of this targets report showed that the finance for biodiversity globally is around $80 to $90 billion. So $80 to $90 billion is getting put into increasing biodiversity and encouraging industries to allow biodiversity to flourish. Now, this already we know is not nearly enough money to make the changes that we need to see around the world. But also, just to put that into context, $80 to $90 billion a year are put into increasing biodiversity, where it's thought that over $500 billion a year are put into already harmful practices such as overfishing and fossil fuel extraction. So governments that are putting money into the increasing biodiversity are then also funding 5 times more the damage of that ecosystem and that biodiversity anyway. So it seems completely illogical that they would be doing, you know, a little bit of one, but then 5 times of the reverse effect. So hopefully governments can start to see this damaging process is not worth funding anymore, and actually they need to start transferring that money across to those ecologically friendly and environmentally sort of incentivized themes. And just a last bit of sort of data from that report for Target 3 was that the World Bank estimates that the loss in revenue due to mismanagement of fisheries was in the area of $83 billion. So actually, if the governments were to invest a little bit more into the good management of fisheries instead of just paying lots of money to try and increase the size and the scale, they would actually have $83 billion more in revenue in the fishing industry. So we can really start to see that if we start looking long term, start looking at, you know, what we know about biodiversity and productivity, we need to start investing in these ways that can protect the environment, and you actually get more out of it productivity wise as well as biodiversity wise and sort of health of the ecosystems. So next we are going to look at Target 6, which is sustainable management for aquatic living resources. So this is basically a fancy way of saying overfishing. Okay, that's the biggest problem that we are seeing in our oceans today, and this target is looking at overfishing. So the good news is that this target has made some more progress with increased assessments of fish stocks, and also increase in sort of cracking down on IUU fishing, which is illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, which is obviously having a positive effect. However, this is still not enough to reach the target that they had set out, and in fact the proportion of fish stocks that are overfished is still increasing, and it sits at around 30% of global fish stocks are overfished and therefore in rapid decline, and about 60 to 65% of fish stocks are maximally exploited, which means they are under a huge amount of pressure as well, but they are just about sustainable because they are at their absolute top limit, which leaves around 5 to 10% of the global fisheries not under a huge amount of pressure. As you can see from the graphic here with the little pie pieces, we can see that the first 2 sub goals of managing stocks a bit more sustainably and recovery plans being made have made a little bit of progress. However, the fisheries having no significant impacts, adverse impacts, has had no progress, and the impacts of fisheries within safe ecological limits has also had no progress. So even though there is a small amount of progress in those first 2, the second 2 have seen little to no progress in the last 10 years. And interestingly, in this target, the UN describes the very strong negative relationship between fish stocks recovery and the investment through subsidies. So what they're basically saying there is that actually the governments that subsidize the fishing industries more and encourage them to just go out and continue fishing and continue increasing the fishing effort actually see a much worse fish stock recovery. So again, governments need to start opening their eyes to the fact that subsidizing the fishing industry just for people to go and fish more to try and fill the shelves is not going to result in positive impacts in the supermarkets, but also in biodiversity and the health of our oceans. A good example of some positive action that has come from this target is in South Africa, where they have made some restrictions on demersal trawling, which helps protect the vulnerable and fragile ecosystems on the sea floor, and also changing in regulations of some of their commercial fishing vessels has actually meant that the amount of seabirds that were killed each year, which used to be up in the thousands and thousands of seabirds every year killed by commercial fishing around South Africa, has dropped by 90%. And in fact, even better is the fact that the albatross, which across all their species are threatened, and the RSPB put out a report a few years ago stating that overfishing, or the commercial fishing industry, was their albatross's biggest threat. The albatross deaths have actually reduced by 99% around South Africa due to these changes. So there are some positive changes coming in, but as you'll see across almost all of these targets, there is a common theme, which is changes have happened, but not enough changes, and not with enough funding, and not with enough effort and actual action happening. A lot of planning has been happening, but not really putting things into action. So target number 7, which is sustainable agriculture, aquaculture and forestry. Again, steps have been made to increase the sustainability of all agriculture, aquaculture and the forestry industries, with factors such as fertilizer and pesticides. The amount of use has stabilized. However, biodiversity across all 3 of these ecosystems or industries is still declining very rapidly, and there is still huge problems with biodiversity in these areas. Now, one of the most powerful statements that I think is really important to emphasize that is in this report is that food production and agriculture are one of the main drivers of global biodiversity loss. Okay, so what they really put there is that the food we put on our plate and the food we buy from the supermarkets has a huge impact on biodiversity loss if we aren't investing in the right types of agriculture or aquaculture. So we need to make sure that even though governments can do more, and through these targets hopefully governments will be doing more, we can also make big changes in our own actions by supporting the correct types of agriculture and the correct types of aquaculture to support biodiversity growth and not biodiversity loss. Everything that we put on our plate and we buy from the supermarkets has an impact on biodiversity, and we need to make sure it's having a positive one. So the aquaculture, interestingly, is actually the fastest growing food production industry in the world. Aquaculture has its problems, but it also has a lot of potential to be sustainable. The main way it can be sustainable is through inland aquaculture, which means that the farms are on land and sort of completely built instead of actually in the ocean. And this is shown in this report. It is thought that around 2/3 of the inland aquaculture around the world is already classified as sustainable, which is a really good step in the right direction. However, it is when we get into mariculture, which is aquaculture in seawater, that's when we start getting really bad results and big problems, as mariculture causes huge amounts of habitat destruction. Coasts are a really important and vital ecosystem for thousands of different species, particularly places like mangroves and seagrass beds. They are vitally important to fight climate change, nurseries for fish and other invertebrates, and all sorts of thousands of different species live in these coastal regions, and these are getting destroyed for fish farming and for aquaculture. So we need to move away from mariculture and aquaculture being in the ocean, but we can start building up more aquaculture on land, and as long as it's done in the right way, it can be very sustainable. Other problems in mariculture is also chemical and antibiotic leaching into the environment. If the animals in the fish farm actually escape, as what happened to millions of salmon only a few months ago, and escape into the local environment, that can cause devastating impacts on the local ecosystem, as these introduced species are very different from the wild species around them. Another big problem with aquaculture, particularly when we look at fish farming carnivorous fish, is that those fish still need to eat fish. So what do the fish farmers do? They go out and fish wild fish, churn it up into fish meal, and then feed the farm fish with this. So people who are buying farmed fish in order to reduce their impact on the wild populations, actually wild fish are still being caught, but you're just sort of adding an extra step in because you're feeding it to other fish before it gets onto your plate. And there have been some small steps forward, as reported in this report, where more fish farms are using bycatch to feed their fish instead of actively going out and catching more fish, which is a small step in the right direction, but realistically we still don't want very high levels of bycatch, and we still don't want to be influencing the wild ecosystem by having these huge amounts of bycatch just so that we are able to feed our farmed fish. So we need to make sure that we choose wisely when we eat seafood. We are choosing how that is caught or how it is farmed wisely, so that we have less of an impact on biodiversity on land and in the ocean. So looking at our little chart again, we can see that all three areas, aquaculture, agriculture and forestry, all made small progress, but none of them had the progress really needed to see the big changes that we need to help protect biodiversity. Okay, so target number 10 is ecosystems vulnerable to climate change. So this target really was focused on coral reefs, as they are considered the most vulnerable to climate change. The other two ecosystems that they mentioned briefly in this report is mountainous and polar regions, due to the increased amount of ice melt from climate change. So these ecosystems are affected as well. So coral reefs have the most rapidly increasing risk to extinction of all groups assessed. And along with this threat to climate change, this is compounded by other pressures that are put on coral reefs, such as overfishing, habitat destruction, ocean acidification and pollution, which is why they are at such a high risk of extinction, and they are such a vital part of our ecosystems. They should be, and luckily are in this, a priority species that we need to be trying to protect. It was stated in this report that more than 60% of reefs around the world are under threat, and the main drivers of this threat are overfishing and destructive fishing methods such as dynamite fishing, cyanide, destructive commercial fishing methods such as trawling. So this chart here is another very stark and worrying chart. As you can see, the two main targets, which were pressure on coral reefs minimized and then the pressures on other vulnerable ecosystems minimized, the purple actually means that they are going in the opposite direction. So this chart is showing that actually the pressures on coral reefs are actually increasing instead of minimizing, which is what we were hoping to do over the last 10 years. So this is a very stark and worrying reminder of the threat that our coral reefs are under, and the fact that we really need to start making some big changes in order to protect them if we're gonna continue to have a healthy ecosystem on land or in the sea. But there are some positives coming from this target. So for example, the Maldives have started making headway, and they have made 61 marine protected areas around their islands, which start to protect their incredibly unique coral reefs there. And they've also started up many reef monitoring programs to keep an eye and monitor the change of the reefs. And also they are implementing waste disposal management plans, and also attempting to eradicate RUU fishing from around the archipelago in order to protect the endangered species. So there are moves in the right direction, but unfortunately not nearly enough to see any significant change in protection for our coral reefs. And finally, target 11 is about protected areas. Now this one, I'm glad this one's the last one, because it's a little bit more positive and we can come out of it seeing that we are making progress. This is the only one of the 5 targets that I've talked about that was actually considered partially achieved. And this is because the 2 green segments, so terrestrial land, there has been an increase in protection there, and in the coastal areas as well. Now the reason this wasn't considered fully achieved, even though the correct amount of land was actually, or sea was actually protected, is that it takes a lot more than just naming an area protected land to actually protect the species in it and the biodiversity. And this is what has been lacking behind, is the actual management, implementation and governance of these areas to ensure that these protected areas are actually protected and not just labeled as a protected area but still treated like a lot of the other places around the world. But there are definitely some big positives to come from this target. For example, that in fact in the last 20 years, since 2000, the area of marine protected environment has actually increased tenfold in just 20 years. And this is mainly due to some huge, vast marine protected areas in the Pacific, but we are seeing more and more areas around the US and around Europe and Africa and Asia starting to get more protection, including the high seas, which is a hugely important but very tough area to really get proper protection for. And a really interesting part of the report in the protected areas target was the fact that there was a meta-analysis of 165 protected areas from 171 different published studies that found where local people were explicitly involved as stakeholders in the co-management of protected areas, both conservation and socio-economic outcomes were improved. So this shows that if you involve the local people in the initiatives that you are trying to achieve, you actually get a much better outcome. You have more support from the locals as well as international support, and you won't be fighting against the locals, say if you're taking away their fishing rights or anything like that. If you can work with them and get them involved, it really does prove to have a much more beneficial effect for everyone, the local ecology, the local economy, and biodiversity in general. A really positive example of what's been happening in terms of protected areas was from Costa Rica, where they have established the Cabo Blanco Marine Management Area, which is a huge area of 80,000 hectares, which protects nesting sea turtles, many commercially valuable fish, and also is a well-known area for whales and dolphins. And this protected area is really giving all of these animals and species a haven in which they are protected and they can reproduce and hopefully create a lot more biodiversity in this area. So that's it for the UN Global Biodiversity Outlook report. The main thing you can take from this is that even though none of the goals were hit, there is a lot of progress happening, which is really positive and good to see. However, it can't shadow the fact that we are still not doing enough, and nature and biodiversity is in a really bad way at the moment, and we must start addressing this. We must start telling governments to prioritize biodiversity, the environment and climate change if we are to continue seeing the kind of life and biodiversity that we see today. And changes can be made and progress can be made if people are willing to work together and put effort in, and hopefully funding can start to increase as well as these targets become more and more evident that they are a huge priority for human survival as well as survival of up to 1 million other species on the planet.